Welcome to the Altogether Show with Eric Satz. On this show, you'll hear Eric's unfiltered interviews with interesting and untraditional entrepreneurs who ignored boundaries, followed their instincts and own paths, and are now empowering others to do the same. Subscribe to the show and learn more by visiting altogether.show. And now your host, Eric Satz.
My guest on the show this week is Jonathan McBride, just an incredible human being. We met in college on opposite sides of the pitch, both playing soccer for NESCAC schools. He's someone I call a lifelong friend. He ran presidential personnel for the White House under President Obama before becoming global head of diversity and inclusion for BlackRock. He is something special. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it.
This episode of the Altogether Show is brought to you by Alto IRA. Alto is a digital, self-directed IRA company modernizing IRA investing. They make it easy and cost-effective for individual investors to access their retirement savings and invest in alternative assets. To learn more, visit altoira.com.
Jonathan McBride, great to have you on, brother.
Good to see you, man. Good to see you.
Great to see you. Where are you?
I'm in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, oddly for the first time in my life. I was actually born in Montana, in Bozeman, and all my family's out here. But for some reason, I've never been to this wonderful place. And I just needed to get out of California for a little while. So I'm here with a really good friends, has a place here. And have been doing some amazing hiking. And the people here are just phenomenal.
Yeah, no. So my favorite ski mountain by far.
Yeah.
So I may have to meet your friends because
Yeah.
I make no bones about picking friends with ski houses. I think it's an important metric.
Yeah, it's one of those life lessons you learn at some point if you're lucky. And she's got a great place. She's renovated, but it's the original house, so it's just fantastic. And it brings me. I was born out here and then raised in the Midwest, but there's kind of a sensibility, a simplicity to life, and kind of like a very straightforwardness around about people in towns and cities like this that you just miss when you're away from it, but you don't realize it as much until you come back. And then you recognize it in every personality, every interaction, every conversation.
It's funny you say that because if you talk to people who live in New York City, and you've lived in New York City,
yes,
and they think there's no other place to live.
Yeah, that's true in a lot of cities. I think LA. I live in LA now, and LA's like New York. What? But yeah, there's a little bit of that. But it's just. When you're in a place, and I traveled a lot this year, as you know, and, there are certain places where no one asks you what you do for a living. Right. They don't really care, actually.
Right.
They do want to know who you are and what you're about. And there's kind of very basic standards. Are you a decent person? Do you like the outdoors? Are you respectful of nature and the ecosystem you live in? That's kind of like the basic threshold here, and I love it.
So that's a great segue to what I'm going to describe as the brief bio of Jonathan McBride, which is you grow up in Milwaukee, you go to a second-rate NESCAC school, and for those who don't know, I went to a NESCAC school, so I can say that.
And we played against each other in soccer, which is why he's taken a little bit of a dig, and they might have had a better record against us over the time we played against each other. They may have. It was lucky.
We may have. You go to Wharton for graduate school. You sell out and you become an associate at Goldman Sachs. And then you leave, and I'm being facetious when I say sell out, by the way, but you leave to start a company. You become an entrepreneur, and we'll get there. And you make your way to the White House, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And then after the White House, you become the global director of diversity and inclusion for BlackRock. No small task.
Yep.
And now I would say you're on the beach, but you're actually sitting on a mountain in Jackson Hole. A good time, by the way, to try and figure out what may be next. And that's all sort of what we just went through is very factual. But I'd love to hear from you who Jonathan McBride is.
Well, a lot of people when they go that random walk through a career that you just described, I get asked often, and I was asked as recently as yesterday, how'd you plan all of that? And it kind of goes all the way back to my beginning, because you can see these threads better in reverse than you ever saw them going forward or living them, as you know. But what you didn't say was that, I was born out here in Bozeman, but I'm half black and half Syrian by birth. My parents are both white. I was adopted at birth. My parents had 2 daughters already. They were both white, so my older sisters are white too. And then a couple years later, they adopted my brother from an orphanage in Korea who's half black and half Korean. And we grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is the most hyper-segregated city in the United States most years. Like, I joke around that in Milwaukee, when we hyper-segregate, we do it well. But the point of that is, like, way more of who I am predates all of that, right? Before college and growing up with this family that was unusual to say by any stretch back then in the 70s and 80s in Milwaukee. And one of the core things I've just realized about myself over the years was that, I had friends who were like me who were kind of reacted negatively to those types of dynamics, or they tried to fit in really hard or be one group and kind of deny other parts of their personality. Something about the confidence my parents instilled in my brother and me, we just kind of felt like we belonged to every group, even though we technically belonged to none,
Right.
And if you look through my life, at every stop, my side job was worrying about other people. When I was at Con, I got on the admissions committee. When I was at Wharton, I was an admissions fellow my second year. When I was at Goldman, I was the recruiting captain for all the schools that didn't have captains and helped run the summer program. Like, you go through the whole thing. My company was targeting young people coming out of grad school who are trying to find their way in life. And we had magazines and websites for a whole bunch of audiences. And then in the category of Better, Lucky, and Smart, I got a chance to work for the first black president doing personnel for him, which was about getting his team, but also sending a signal to the whole country. And that was the first time I did that type of thing, like culture and people and everything else, full time. And it was at the highest level, so it was fantastic.
So I want to back up, and we're just going to jump right in, because you said, you kind of didn't feel like you actually ever belonged to a single group, but belonged to kind of every group, which I think is a really unique perspective, because, and I think this conversation has certainly come to the surface in the last couple of months, which is that, an ounce of black blood makes you black. Mm-hmm. How do you have a reaction to that line of thinking? Is that surprising to you?
No. I think that, how people identify is, like, we're learning more and more. Things are more fluid, and people have more self-discretion. When we were growing up, gender was binary, right? Like, so the question is, like, how do you think about yourself, and what portion of you do you identify with, right? Because there's like 3 portions to our identity. There are innate things we're born with, right? I'm 6'2", or whatever the case may be. There's a second category of which is what people assign to us. And you got to be tricky with those, because sometimes people put things on, on your identity, or give you badges or whatever that you don't really deserve, and you kind of overinvest in them. But the third category, importantly, are those that you choose to become a part of. And those are the ones that are the trickiest, because you care a lot and care enough to choose to be a part of a group, but if you get rejected by it, you really feel it as a result, right? So a lot of people would be born into a group where they'd be treated like they were black or brown skinned, because they literally have black and brown skin, and it's immediately a part of their experience. So they're probably more in the first category. But there are people who might have been born with a very different complexion, treated very differently, but are realizing, I consider myself a little bit more a part of the third. Even though technically I am part of the first, it's something I'm coming to later in life, potentially. So, but the main thing is, this is for each individual to figure out. I think what the BLM movement is just doing a lot of things, but one of the things that movement did is it told a whole bunch of people, by the way, white, yellow, black, brown, whatever, right, that it's not about you, it's about the other person. Right? They get to choose. It's like the microaggression theory. It's how you receive the thing that matters, even if you didn't mean it. Right?
We're jumping in. So, and there are a couple more things there, because in framing 2 things, race, and microaggressions.
Yes.
I I heard a really interesting framing for both, and I actually agree with both. So on the characteristic of race, and I hope I get this right. The idea that race is a noun as opposed to an adjective that we have created as a classification in order to discriminate, by the way,
yes,
is the root of the problem. In other words, race is not a noun. It's an adjective that we've created.
yes.
It is a characterization that we've created in order to say these people are better and these people are lesser. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Basically what we've done is we've taken that word and we've actually attached to it certain usually physical traits, right? So we've said, oh, black people are this, white people are this, whatever. And then, and if those things were somewhat observable, then the other things we're going to say about those people must be true, which were largely negative for some and positive for others. I mean, just in this simple idea that you have like a black market, which means below the line, or you have a white lie, which is a little innocent one. Like there's so many versions of that are super subtle little things that you're taught from a very early age. And people say, young people don't even see race. Yes, they do. They just don't make as big a deal out of it. But I was just listening to a podcast on the BBC where they're interviewing two white women who had adopted black kids, one in the United States, one in South Africa. The South African mother said the first time her son, when her son was 18 months, he started saying to her, and they would play this game, "Mommy, do you like my color?" And then she would grab him and say, "I love your color." And then he would giggle, and then he would say, "I like your color too." And then they would start over again because he's 18 months, and he's like, "Mommy, I like your color," and it would go on all day. But to say people are colorblind or they don't see race is kind of crazy. They do, and people have used this notion of race, largely based on color and other physical attributes or observable attributes, to separate themselves from other people, to make some people lesser and make themselves or some other people greater.
You know, I've never heard the white lie black market comparison before, and it makes so much sense. And it also ties to, I think, the point about microaggressions.
Yes.
Is there really such a thing as a microaggression?
Yeah, well, I mean, I believe in it. The research started in the 70s.
No, but my point being, by calling it micro.
Oh, I'm a fan of micro. I'm a fan of micro. Let me make my case to you.
Yes.
Like my case to you is the following. And there's a great book, Claudia Rankine wrote a book called Citizen, where she talks about all the little things that we saw happen with our naked eye, with famous people and in popular events and stuff like that. There were little slights that we probably barely missed. And when you read the book, you're like, oh man, I missed that too at the time. But the point is, the reason why I like the microaggression theory is because the theory suggests that there's lots of little things that add up to you feeling alienated. It's not one big moment. And a lot of times people aren't 100% sure the first couple times it happens. So they can be very small. But the other reason why I like it, like the theory, just being very practical as somebody who spent time trying to get people to recognize them and do something about them, is like dieting, it takes steady, small efforts over time to change human behavior. So if I tell you have to change this massive part of yourself and that you're totally biased and blah, blah, whatever, most people are going to be like, yeah, I'll talk to you on Tuesday, right? But if we start to have a conversation about, listen, if you burn more calories than you consume, but you got to kind of do that every day, right? And it's going to take a lot of little steps. And here's the first couple things you can do. You can actually break it into a series of smaller things that people can do to be more respectful about other people and be aware, even if they're unintentionally, start to be aware of when they're delivering these small slights. People have had big slights, but you can go through a long list of very teeny slights, and I can rattle some off for you if you want.
Do it. And
so an example would be...
I agree with everything you're saying. I was trying to reframe in a different way, but please finish. Yeah.
Well, so one of the most common things in all my years of working on this topic in corporate America, a couple of very, very common things that you would hear over and over again. One, the phrase sharp elbows is almost always gendered, and it's almost always women. Two, people will be telling a story in the middle of the story, and they go, and the guy was black. When if the guy was white, they wouldn't have said he was white.
Right.
Three, people will say constantly, oh, this person was so articulate. What are the chances when they say that the person's not white, right? But one of the most pernicious ones.
And athletes, by the way. Athletes.
All the time. Yeah, I can't believe you could actually string a sentence together. One of the most pernicious, though, which I've heard in so many organizations from so many people over such a period of time, is particularly from black and brown women who have curly or kinkier hair. Mm-hmm. And they have a hair story. They have a hair story that is somebody either walking up literally in modern day and touching their hair and just saying, I just wanted to see what it felt like, literally, now. Or when they've either straightened their hair, they'll suddenly get a lot of compliments in the workplace that they say look more professional, or I really like your hair today. Or if they go natural, people will say things like, are you going to keep that? And it's so common and universal. There are bills that have been passed in certain states like California against that kind of bias because it's so common. And my point is, like, these are very little things that happen really fast that somebody could say in public in front of everybody else and no one will really pick up on it except the person receiving it. And even they start to wonder, am I a little sensitive? Like, maybe they really didn't mean it. I'm not entirely sure. But here's the worst part about dominant groups versus non-dominant groups is when you're in the non-dominant group and somebody makes a comment on your hair, they could be complimenting you, but you always worry it's the other.
Right.
So whether they meant it or not, you take on the slight. You take on the paper cut, which is one of now 100. But the other part about it is the other person oftentimes doesn't even know they're delivering it. That's why they keep doing it. That's why microaggressions build up, is because the other person doesn't know it and no one intervenes to say, hey, I know you might not have meant it, but...
So the reason I don't like the term microaggression is because I think it minimizes it for everyone in that dominant group. And people say, oh, they didn't mean it. Just, kind of get over it, as opposed to systematic aggression. I don't know what the right word is, but as in any relationship, yes, it turns out that the little things are really fucking important.
Absolutely.
And so that's why this phrasing of microaggression almost gives people the ability to minimize it as opposed to recognizing it for what it is.
So I look at it the opposite. Okay. I look at it as a dragnet that catches a lot more behavior. Because what happens otherwise is you have someone walking their dog in the park who thinks they're progressive, who probably voted very progressively, who probably has given to causes, probably has a lot of black friends, right?
Right.
But doesn't understand what she's doing in that moment, right? She may not have attended it. She may not have actually been a racist. Who knows what was in her heart or mind? But we do know she leveraged the system, right? She was the one breaking the law, but she called the cops and had a pretty high degree of confidence they're going to come and grab the other guy if she said he was black. So my point of the microaggressions...
For those who don't know what we're talking about, just Google New York Times woman in park,
Amy
black
Cooper.
man.
Amy Cooper, and so, but I would just say that the thing about the microaggressions part of it is, and there was an important thing you said which I didn't say, which is, it says that you might not have meant it in as many as 7 out of 10 cases, but two things. The first thing is, it doesn't mean the person didn't feel it though.
Right.
So you may have zero intent, but you still have impact. And you need to own that. The second thing is, it also catches lots of little behaviors, like bad off-color jokes and things like that people kind of let go, where people would say, oh, that's not racism. That's not a macroaggression. It's not a big old thing. Yeah, it's a little thing and it adds up and it alienates people. But I've also seen multiple times, and I'll tell you a quick story. At one place that I worked, over the many years I've been working, there was a guy who had been part of a group. He was gay, a gay male, and he was part of a group and very much part of the group, and the team was really close-knit, and they got along really, really well. And they go out for a drink one night in some part of the world, and they're all hanging around, and everyone's drinking, and a couple guys had maybe a couple too many drinks. They started kind of making jokes. Somebody was passing around a picture of, like, one of the people in the group's son in his soccer uniform or something or whatever. Mm-hmm. And somebody makes an off-color joke when it gets into that guy's hands, right? And the guy is incensed, as you might imagine. No one really says anything because these things happen super fast, right? They're like bang, bang plays, you know what I mean? No one says anything. And he leaves. He doesn't come into work for a couple of days, and then the next week when he resigns. But when he resigns, he details 14 incidences of bias, with that being the 14th. And what went on there was there were 13 times when he gave everybody the benefit of the doubt because he was solely a part of the team the day before.
Right.
But when he got a dispositive indicator, he flipped on all of them, right? Now, he may or may not have been right, but that is a logical, natural human response because these things are 51-49 calls a lot of times, right? They're really, maybe they meant it, maybe they didn't, I don't know, but I sure am feeling it, you know?
Right. No, I think that's so important. Does it really matter whether he was right or wrong? Because he was clearly feeling what he was feeling.
I think we're all listen, all of our feelings are valid and relevant, but I think we also have to pay attention to the science and the data and the reality of such things. So on the flip side, I tell people, listen, if somebody's kind of doing something that's bothering you and they've done it multiple times, you can choose to think that they woke up that morning to microaggress you. You could choose to do that. But most people don't wake up in the morning and say, today I'm just going to be at Sats all day by little comments and little paper cuts, right? What really happens is we're so self-interested and self-absorbed that when we're talking and doing things, we're only thinking about ourselves and what everybody thinks of us. We're not really thinking about the other people. So if you want to take it as a microaggression and stack it up and start to feel more alienated, you can. It's just a really bad bet because statistically you're going to be wrong a lot, way more than you're right. But you do have an obligation to say to somebody or get someone to say to the person, hey, you didn't mean it, but somebody might have taken it this way, so maybe you want to change your words.
Communication in any environment, in any relationship, is sort of key to longevity and success, I think. And I think you're pointing that out.
Yeah.
So we jumped right in. Let's go back a little bit.
Okay, cool.
We know where you were born. You were born in Montana. When were you born?
I was born in 1970, June 11th, 1970, in Bozeman, Montana.
And when were you adopted?
I had to be with foster parents for about a week because my dad was away he was like hiking or something like that. And so it took a week, but I was basically at birth. They kind of had signed everything beforehand, but then I transferred hands, I think, at day 7 or 8 or something like that.
So how do you all end up in Milwaukee?
My father was at grad school when they adopted me. My parents had both grown up in homes that would not have approved or kind of thought that this was the way you would go, interracial families and all that kind of stuff. But through an experience of being in the military when he got out of college and living with people from all different backgrounds, because the military has unbelievable diversity, my parents kind of rethought their childhoods. And when they got to grad school, they started being the advisors to the Black Student Union for the undergrads and advising them and being kind of like some older people that they could be friends with. And my dad was getting his graduate degree at the same time. When he finished, the first job he could get was at a thing called probation and parole, which is like, it's in northern Wisconsin. We were in Merrill, Wisconsin, which is a teeny town. And he was working up there, and it was the first place he could get a job, and we were there. I think there was, if I remember correctly, I don't remember, but if the story is in my head is accurate, I think there was one Chinese family that owned a Chinese restaurant, and then there's my family who had me. And everybody else was white. Seriously, in the whole town. So we moved probably when I was 3 to Milwaukee, which is southeastern Wisconsin and the biggest city and the most diverse, but again, hyper segregated. And moved into, intentionally, my parents moved us into a pretty diverse and up and coming neighborhood where you had all these different people, all these different mixed families. In my neighborhood growing up, I had Hasidic Jews, openly gay couples, interracial marriages, interracial adoptions. We had a near neo-Nazi across the street. Like no, seriously. And I played at his house all the time. The neighborhood was just a crazy amalgam of people. That was a little hamlet. It was called Sherman Park. It was a little hamlet inside of this city that was obviously more hyper-segregated. But books have been written about it, and it was an incredible place to grow up.
Where and when do you meet our friends David and Mona Sutphin?
They live in Sherman Park too. So when we moved there, I remember this vividly. You'll appreciate this. I'm sitting underneath my mom's desk as she's taking a call from another guy from the east side of Milwaukee. She hangs up the call and she goes, "Jonathan, do you want to learn to play soccer?" And I was like, "Sure." And I didn't even know what she was talking about. And so I was 5.
Right.
And the call was from a guy on the east side of Milwaukee who said, "Hey, there's this kind of youth sport that's springing up and it's great for kids. It's going on in the suburbs. We're thinking about starting a Milwaukee Kickers soccer club, but we need someone on the north side, we have lots of kids and everything else, to run it from the north side. Are you in?" because my mom was really loved community organizing and stuff like that. And so she called back and accepted it. And then David was part of Sherman Park, so we were in the same neighborhood. And all the teams were organized by neighborhood. Boys and girls played together. Dave and I were on 2 separate teams, but we were near each other, so we played each other a lot. And then eventually at age 11 or 12, we started playing on the same team.
So how do you end up at Conn College?
Two people who are related. My closest friend in high school, Skip McGregor, his mother went there and was a very proud alum, and a woman that I really admired and liked a lot and was close with. And then I dated his cousin, Diane Stratton, who was a year older than me.
So
I
met Diane when I was in Milwaukee with Sutphin. Yeah.
Yeah, she's just the best. She's a fantastic human being, and she and I were in high school together. She was a year older. We dated. We stayed friends. Then she goes to Connecticut College, and I'm a senior. And as you know, I'm looking at Amherst and at Connecticut College, and I'm also looking at Brown and Emory and a bunch of other places, and being recruited at a couple of schools. But I'm like on the phone with Diane while she's in her first year of college, and the soccer team's going 13-0-1, but she's friends with all soccer players. So these soccer players all keep jumping on the phone. And I just get really comfortable with the place. And so 2 things happened. One, I didn't get into Amherst, even though I was told I was in.
We're not smart.
It was a bummer.
We're not smart. What can I say?
I got 2 phone calls saying I was in, and then I got a letter saying not only was I not waitlisted, I was flat out rejected.
Oh.
And then, but I had gotten in everywhere else, and Connecticut seemed so familiar to me, and so I chose to go there. And then a year later, I'm playing with those guys I had been talking to, and one of them is one of my closest friends today, which is just, when you think about it, the chances of it. But I got there through personal relationships. I just knew that I wanted to go to a small school versus big. I wanted to go to a liberal arts college, and I wanted to play soccer, and that was it. That's all I knew.
And by the way, I'll just say the soccer field at Conn College, I think, is one of the most idyllic settings for a college athlete. Just because you're packed in there. Yeah.
You're in the middle of the camp. You're in the middle of academic buildings one side, residential halls on the other side, rolling hills with the sound down below you, the New England Sound, and a soccer field. And by the way, no football team.
Yeah, no football team. I didn't even remember
No football
that.
team.
So,
yeah, there was no football team. So it was great.
And it was a great place to go and win. So.
Nice.
So.
It wasn't a fun place to play, though. Our fans were pretty bananas, right? They were very rowdy.
So I think, again, probably tying to the earlier conversation, playing at almost every NESCAC school, the fans could be a little bit brutal on the sidelines.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's fair. That's fair.
Hopefully there are a few changes on that front. By the way, could you play for Conn College today when you look at their team? Because I cannot play for Amherst. I cannot play for Amherst.
Yeah, you could. You could. You could, because you'd be better. You'd be more advanced. They're getting more teaching earlier than we did, and more
bigger,
instruction.
They're faster. Well, you had size, but
yeah. I could play today, but I will. But as you mentioned, the players have gotten much better. The quality of play is higher. They have, one of the things in this current environment about the residential college experience is and we talked about this, when people are thinking about whether to go back to school or not. One of the questions was, it was interesting. One of the questions was, whether the fall athletes will come back, particularly the soccer players and other sports that are good. And it dawned on me that for today's Division III soccer player, there's hopes of playing in the MLS or in Europe. And so to protect your eligibility, you might not come back if you don't have a season. I would never have thought of that when I was in college, was playing Division III. I would have just come back and hung out.
It's different.
But it's different. There's far more options, and American players are respected more, and there are more pipelines.
And there's an NCAA championship for Division III that didn't exist when we were there, and
we didn't get to play in it. Not for us. We didn't get to play in it.
But now Amherst is one of those champions, as you may know. But
and we went pretty far last year and have been pretty good. In fact, I think we had a little better record than you guys over the last 5 years. But anyway,
maybe. We did lose in the semifinals.
Our team's pretty good.
No, I have no doubt. And the one other thing that I would say is I think there's very little difference today between the athlete who chooses to play Division III soccer at some of these schools and the athletes who go Div 1. You know, I think they're making conscious decisions.
Well, I think they're much more conscious decisions. Yes, when we were in college, if I remember correctly, I got to go to the All New England game twice. I actually went neither year, for the record, just for a bunch of crazy reasons. I regret that now, but what New England did, because there was such parity, right? You had like teams with tons of players who went and played professional and were great players in Division III because they wanted to play multiple sports, or they were very serious students and got into a great school or whatever. But when New England chose the All-Star game, they just chose the best 18 players on this side and 18 players on that side. They didn't care about level. So you got invited, but it wasn't about being Div 3, Div 2, Div 1. Like when you make All-American or All-New England, it's like by level. In All-New England, when they picked the All-Star games, it was all mixed up because the teams were so good. And all our preseason games were against Brown and Yale and all the Division I teams.
Right.
So it was really mixed back then because I think people were making a lot of different choices because there were fewer options. Nowadays, no.
Yeah, I didn't get any invites to the All-Star game.
So I had to sneak that in there.
Well done. Well played, actually. So,
thanks.
Why do you go to business school? How do you end up at Wharton?
Actually, ending up at Wharton, so the one thing we didn't mention in my bio is between undergrad and grad, I actually worked for Herb Kohl, who's a senator from my home state of Wisconsin in D.C., but I got that job opportunity by luck, actually, and took it. But politics hadn't really been. My family is very socially minded and very politically active, so politics was a part of my life. But I wasn't planning to go work in D.C. And after spending a couple years there and helping run part of his re-election campaign in 1994, I wanted to get back on the path I was on, which is to be in business. But I came from a family of psychologists and educators and artists, and no one I knew really was a business person. I just knew when I was growing up, whenever I drove by like a busy ice cream store or saw somebody doing something, I was like, how does that work? How do they make money? Like, how do they survive? Like, that was where my brain went, which is like where my parents and my sisters went, were like, what are they learning in school? Or like, how do they feel about themselves? You know what I mean? Like, and my default was, how does that work? How do we do this? And whenever I was around people like uncles and things like that who were business people, even at a young age, there's always pictures of me sitting with them, asking them lots of questions. So I always knew I wanted to be in business. Herb was a businessman. He had run Kohl's food stores, which became Kohl's department stores. He bought the Milwaukee Bucks famously. And so I wanted to get back on that track. I just didn't know what I wanted to do. So I went to, I had a liberal arts undergrad. I wanted to go to a more quantitative business school. And I thought I wanted to go into finance because I wanted to understand how money worked. I didn't know if I wanted to be in finance my whole life. I just knew I wanted to understand how money worked. So Wharton became the most obvious choice. And got a great education. And interned and then worked full-time for Goldman Sachs after that, and I got to see literally like front row how money worked, and it was a great education. But I also got to see how, back then, how great organizations. It was private then,
right?
It was run very. There's a very intimate feel to it, and it was an extremely respected organization, and I got to see how great organizations operate. And a funny story, when I told Herb I was going to business school, we're driving in a car together. He goes, "I'll help you get in. But I'll write your recommendation, do whatever you want, but I want to ask you a favor." He's like, "I want you to come back to DC, but I don't want you to come right back. Go out and work for a great company and see what great companies look like. Go start something so you know what it's like to be a builder, and then come bring that work experience back here because there's not enough business people in DC." And oddly, I go to Goldman, I start Jungle Media Group, I sell it, I start a consultancy for the people who bought my company, and then I end up back in the White House. And like month 5, I'm walking on West Exec Drive, and who do I see? Herb Kohl. And I'm like, "Senator, it worked." It was great. And he was like, it took him a second. He knew I was in town, but it took a second, and then he was like, "Jonathan." It was great. It was really great.
Just the way he drew up on the board for you.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect play.
Just follow the play, McBride. Just follow the play.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
So, people make big decisions when they leave sort of the security, and by security, that has broad implications, right? Financial and otherwise, of a place like Goldman Sachs, to jump out on their own and be an entrepreneur. Can you walk us through your thinking at the time? Do you remember the analysis and the drive?
Absolutely.
Walk us through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I will. And I think that there are, because I talk to a lot of people at different career stages, and I have this sports related, including you. I have a sports-based analogy I often use, which is that for most of us, most of the time we're making career decisions because things are coming at us if we're lucky. You're playing tennis, right? Like you're like the person hits the ball and your body's already moving, and it's like muscle memory, and you're reacting to another player. But every once in a while, you get to these kind of stair-step portions of your life where you're playing golf. The ball's just sitting there. There's nothing to react to. There's a million things you can get wrong from here to here, and everybody's just sitting there watching. You know what I mean? And those moments when you've got millions of roads you could go down, you have to pick one and try to figure out what's best with limited information and stuff like that. People think leaving Goldman to start Jungle was the latter. It was the former, and here's why. We wrote the business plan in business school, sitting in the back of classes, reading magazines like Forbes and Fortune, which were written for our parents, and saying, where's the magazine or the media company that's telling us how to take... We just take on a bunch of loans, we have this great degree, but how do we get to become a Forbes reader, right? Like, how do we get through this time? And back then, MBA students changed jobs 2.5 to 3 times in the first 4 years. It was like a very kind of early stage, you were kind of finding your way. And so we wrote a business plan in business school in a great class at Wharton where you had the first day of class, everybody who had an idea. It was an entrepreneurship class taught by a guy who had started dozens of companies. And the first day of class, you stand up in front and you pitch your idea to the rest of the group. And what starts off as like 50 ideas becomes like 10 good ideas because people join other teams because they're like, we like that idea. So we got into the class and we pitched our thing and other students joined us. And then we had a team, so we were in the class and we wrote the business plan. And then we went out and worked for... Two of us worked for Goldman, one worked for McKinsey. But we also saw the kind of competition ratcheting up and the money being put into recruiting people like us. And we realized there was a bigger install base of advertisers than we thought, which were not just the brand advertisers like Hugo Boss and BMW and Dewar Scotch. There was going to be these recruitment advertising that would probably pick up really quickly. And so I remember it vividly. I was roommates with the guy I'd written the business plan with in business school, after business school. We're both working at Goldman. I come home one day, and I'm just like, I don't know if I'm going to stay at Goldman. And he's like, what? He's like, you love that place. Like, you're like, as happy as can be. I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I can be long term. He walks out he goes in the bedroom, comes back out with a big business plan with Post-it notes on it. He's like, remember this? We do nights and weekends. And kind of rewrite the business plan and write it for graduate people coming out of business school, law school, medical school, all the same psychographic, right? They're 30-year-olds who have this psychographic of a 40-year-old, so the return on getting them as a customer early is big. And so we're writing this business plan, and I go and meet with a good friend, Jeff Bernstein, who was running the tech coverage group at Goldman. He had created it and was like one of my mentors and advisors and somebody I really trusted. And I understood what was going on with technology because we had a whole web play. And in the meeting, after he read the plan, he's like, this is a great effing idea, you guys. And I just asked him, will you be first money in as an angel? He's like, yeah. I'm like, will you join our board? He said, yeah. And we go home, and the next day I come back from work, and my roommate is sitting in the apartment in his sweats. And I was like, did you go to work today? He goes, I did, only to quit. Like, I'm entrepreneurial. He was an entrepreneur. Yeah. The moment he got someone writing him a check, once he had his proof of idea, like validation of the idea, he couldn't work for somebody else anymore. So he literally went in and quit and came back to the house and was eating like Doritos and like working on the plan. And so I had to think long, and I actually had to think long and hard about it. But 2 things were key to that decision that might be helpful to other people. The first was I realized, for a whole bunch of reasons, that life in my experience comes down to sometimes difficult questions and sometimes difficult answers, and you need to know which one you're in. And when I realized that, I was struggling with an answer I already had. Not, am I going to go? It was like, yeah, I'm going, but like I'm getting comfortable. But the other thing which was important for me was doing a decision tree and just saying, okay, what are the possible outcomes here if I go? And then weighting them and kind of doing the whole probability analysis that good, analytical people would do. But I realized really quickly, there's one branch on this tree that would be unacceptable to me. Everything else I could accept. If I go and we fail or whatever, if I go and we succeed. But if I don't go, and these other 2 guys quit their jobs, and they do it I will never forget myself. And what that did, which is really important when you're at these moments, is you have to be clear about your incentives. And I realized that I wasn't starting this company to be super successful and all these things that would happen down the road. I was starting because I wanted to know that I could. I wanted to see, after all these years of talking a big game and thinking about it, can I do this? So I realized that actually, once I quit, the next day, I've actually already achieved a big thing.
Yeah.
Right? It made the big decision much smaller, and made all of the running it for 6 and 7 years and keeping it alive and growing it and selling it. That was all gravy. The potatoes, like the meat, whatever, was like the getting the guts and being in the less than 1% of people with ideas who actually quit with no paycheck.
That's the hard part.
And spend 5 months trying to raise money, paying themselves, not knowing what's going to happen, and convincing other people to join their idea.
Amen. That is the. So it's funny because, you know, I feel like the probability question is a bit of a red herring. Because
it was way too weird. It was like I spent too much time on it. It was a simpler analysis. You're right.
Right, because if you're true to yourself, and entrepreneurs, if you're true to yourself in your analysis, the probability of success, you have to put it 10% or less. If you're true, right? And if that's your analysis, you never do it, right? So that can't be the driver. It's got to.
Well, actually, so Gladwell wrote an article in 2012, I think, something like that, in the New York Times Magazine. I might get the date wrong, but it's about entrepreneurship. But his argument is everybody thinks of entrepreneurs as big risk seekers, and he argues, which I think is right, they're risk mitigators. By the time they jump, they have so thoroughly thought through every contour of failure, and done everything they can to mitigate it, that they're jumping. But yet still, you know, back, I don't know what that is now, but when I was graduating from business school, I worked in admissions. You know, you had like something like a third to half of the people wrote on their essays that they wanted to go out and start something at some point. It was like really, really high. And 10 years after graduation, the numbers were like 1.5% that actually quit and started something. It was a very, very low number. But so I think that it's still, for whatever reason, it's still a very small number, but it's not swashbuckling risk taking.
No, it's not
at all.
And I do think that's something that's misunderstood about entrepreneurs. And you know, the delta between the 33% who say they want to do it and maybe the 1.5% that actually do is that you know, you can do death by analysis too, right?
That would have been the probabilities on the tree.
Right? Because at the end of the day, even if you do all of the quote-unquote risk mitigation, of why it should work, there are macro and micro events that happen that you can't control, right? And they put you in a reactionary position, and hopefully you can adopt and pivot appropriately, but the fact of the matter still is that 90% fail. That's absolutely that's the math, right?
And I think one of the things you got to know, but to the point about knowing yourself, like whether I was born this way or I evolved this way based on trying a lot of things early in life, you know, the more entrepreneurial mindset is comfortable starting to move with 10 or 15 or 20% of the information, but they don't fall in love with their idea. They're taking in data the whole time and adjusting. Whereas my friends and family members who are lawyers, for instance, or something like that, they want to think through the whole thing thoroughly over many weeks or months or whatever and align all the facts before they take a first step. And that's not better or worse. It's just different. It's like, do I process in the moment or do I process over time, right? It's like people are on a spectrum. And you definitely need to kind of know yourself. I will tell you the moment I actually really, really knew was after I had jumped, to be honest. I'm on a plane, I'm reading an article, it's Forbes or Fortune, and they did this interview, 10 questions of CEOs, and they're interviewing Clive Davis, Mr. Motown, right? And so, and for those of you who don't know, he was like one of the most influential record producers in America in history, and really is responsible for some of the greatest acts that came out of Motown in the 50s and the 60s. And he happens to be a white man. And anyway, so they were interviewing him. He was 64 or 67 at the time. Napster had already hit. People were being sued for downloading files for free and all that stuff. and he's launching, I think it was Arista Records, but he's launching a new record company, like a traditional record company, in the middle of the business model being blown up. And one question they asked him, it wasn't the last one, but it was like the 8th or 9th, was, Clive, you're in your 60s, you have more money than you can stake at, you're a legend in the industry, you're going to be in the Hall of Fame, all that stuff. Like, why are you starting a traditional label right now? And his answer was, I'm one of the people who wants to know if they're right.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I was like, and to me, it's like, there are people who will take being wrong multiple times in exchange for a chance to find out, am I right, and can I do this, and can I make something happen? Yeah. It's like hard, and do you think it's biological? Do you think it was pre-wired into you?
I do. And by the way, that's not to say that you have to be born an entrepreneur. I think you can learn and evolve and develop into an amazing entrepreneur. But there's something innate that's just like, I see a problem and I want to know if I can fix it.
Yes.
And
yeah.
I don't, and it's.
I think it's my old boss, Larry Fink, who used to. I remember when he left a very strong impression on me, incredibly positive impression on me. But one of the things I remember when we were talking about during the period of time with Me Too and all these other things were going on, I remember he started talking about it. And he actually even gave a speech where he talked about the people have kind of a natural bias to being kind of more passive or kind of a watcher or processor, or a bias towards action, right? Like you kind of have more of a bystander bias or a bias towards action. And he described himself as somebody who definitely has more of a bias towards action. He even joked that he doesn't like going to sporting events sometimes because he can't get in there. But it was a very serious and very thoughtful commentary, because he was, at the time, what he was signaling to people is like, in moments like these where you kind of need to watch out for each other, I want you to be activists for each other, right? Which is a really great message. But I have always been prone, probably like you, to action. Like I wasn't in college and in grad school and all these other places. The reason why I was on so many things is not because I wanted to pad my resume. It was because, like, when I saw something, I might complain about it, but like the next day I was trying to do something about it. Like it was just how I was fundamentally wired. And the reason why I bring this up is because I've had time off this year to reflect on a lot of things. One of the most important things I've reflected on was that the danger. I'm not saying that if you're on different ends of the spectrum, it's a bad thing, but we all need to be careful. All of us need to be careful about being bystanders as a part of a system that enables certain people to do bad things. To the rogue traders and the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, like people who do like kind of extreme acts, right, are hard to connect with and understand, and they're not like most people. Most people are not going to get there. But when you think of all the people around these individuals that had to, over time, like a toad in the water getting warmer, slowly get more and more comfortable with not just allowing, but enabling them to do those things, which they kind of knew. They might compartmentalize, but it was in there. That could be anybody. You take any of those people and you interview them 10 years earlier, and you set up a scenario, and they would say, no way. I would storm out, I would say something, I'd call the cops. And I believe them. I'm sure they would. But everybody, whether out of self-interest or inertia or, whatever, can fall into that bystander. And that's our big risk these days. And again, going back to this current moment, what I'm hearing a lot of people saying is like, I don't think of myself as a racist, but I was complicit by not saying or doing anything and not asking enough questions and not holding people to account. And that's why people are hopeful now. They're hopeful that something different's happening.
And I think that what that also raises is the idea that it's not really enough or a thing to quote unquote not be racist. You have to be anti-racist. And we talked about the book, how a couple weeks ago, whatever, about how to be an anti-racist. And, I'll confess, I didn't think that way, right? I didn't think that way. It's not enough to just, quote unquote, not be racist. You actually have to take action in the other direction.
Yeah, I think when things were in our life growing up, whether you're talking about in a communal setting or a social setting at school or at work, when these things happened to others, even if we recognize what was going on, the safe place for most people to be was like, just don't say anything, don't make it more uncomfortable. Maybe I'll go talk to the person afterwards or whatever who was on the receiving end. But there was comfort in knowing I wouldn't do that. I will even talk badly about the person who said it because I'm so outraged that I'm a good person, right? But that's inactivity. And for a long time, it was a smart play because there was no cost for inactivity. Now, there is. The balance has shifted, and the weighting of the variables has shifted. And for a lot of people now, when you're inactive, it's a vote for the status quo. It's a vote for the system that's holding people down, or the person who said whatever. And so it's almost being complicit, candidly.
Yeah, I think that's the point.
And it's how people are going to look at it. Yep, and people are going to look at it that way. And so the cost balances have shifted, which is why it's interesting, this Black Lives Movement in the United States and across the world. And by the way, we're talking about blacks and whites in America, but every country has a black-white issue, right? You know? So it just happens to be ours that we're talking about, but everybody's got stuff to deal with. And but it's really interesting. The pressure this time around, as opposed to the past 10 years, is much more inside of companies out. It's much more employees up to management and CEOs. And that, I think, is part of that shift. It's like, no, sitting back and being inactive is not okay with us who live with you day to day, right? Like, you might be able to dodge the spotlight of the outside world, but we live with you here in the community. We're all part of a community you help build and that you lead, and we're saying, no, you gotta tell us where you stand. And I think that's a really, really positive outcome of the
So let's fast forward to the White House. How do you end up at the White House? And if you don't mind, and I'm just going to be quiet for a while here, tell us about the experience of working for President Obama and all that you did in that environment.
So I think that first on the getting the White House is something that we kind of alluded to, but we didn't talk about as entrepreneurs. We were talking about being entrepreneurs, which is that a lot of life is luck. You know, people want to write case studies looking back about how they made all these perfect decisions. And you never hear when they got lucky and when they screwed up and someone saved their butt. You know, but there's a lot of that. Getting the White House, you know, there are a lot of ways to get there, but luck's almost always involved just because of the numbers. I happen to know people who had stayed in D.C. or stayed in that orbit when I left to go do all these other things. And a couple of them made a very wise decision when a self-described skinny guy with big ears decided to run for the office, is that they went with him even though they had ties with other candidates and stuff like that. And when he won, and I had been talking to them during the campaign, but when they won, I was able to get my resume to the right people who were kind of sitting there with the gazillions of resumes. To put in perspective, because I worked for him, in the couple of days after the election, Obama got over 250,000 resumes.
And
if you looked in the database of the resumes, it's a lot of resumes in 48 hours. And there were, you know, if you look in the database, you would see like CEOs of companies who didn't know how to get in, would like put their stuff in the database. But I was lucky enough to know people who knew people, and so I was just I was in a different pool. I was in a pool that got considered maybe more fully. I didn't get a job right away. I didn't hear anything, actually. And then I started coming down and interviewing in April and May, and they weren't even really telling me at first exactly what I was interviewing for. I wasn't 100% sure. I had an idea. But I kept coming back and forth, and each round of interview kept being more senior. And then in May, I was meeting with the senior-most people I could meet with, pretty much, except for the president. And one of them stayed back afterwards and told me, we think we want to do this. We'll come back to you in a couple weeks. And I didn't hear anything for 2.5 months. And when you talk about moments in your life where you feel every minute, like you remember every minute, like that was the slowest 2.5 months ever. But I get a call at the end of July, literally the day before, like as I'm boarding a flight to South America. We had decided to go celebrate my mom's birthday there, and they're like, "Hey, can you be in DC on Tuesday?" This is a Friday, and I'm thinking, "Oh yeah, they're probably going to want to interview me again." So I cut my vacation short. I go to my mom's birthday party for a couple of days, and I fly back from Colombia with a bag. Stay with a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, Joe Carbet, and go in, and all of a sudden I'm being fingerprinted and meeting with the FBI, and like and it was like 2 hours long. So then I walk out. This is a true story. I walk out. I called the guy I was starting company with, and I said, I have good news and bad news. I think I just got hired, so I'm not starting the company with you. And then I called my buddy who I'm staying with, who's at work. I'm like, hey, can I stay with you? He's like, how long? I'm like, I don't know, a year, 2? I'm like, he's like, did you get the job? I'm like, yeah, I got the job. So I came in as a deputy director of personnel, which is the office that hires people. So there are roughly 2.4 million people who work in government at any given time. Most of them aren't in D.C. They're here in Jackson or anywhere else. But a new president coming and going has roughly, the number's lower now, probably about 4,400 spots. When we were there, it was 5,800 slots that they could fill. And about a third of them were part-time boards or advisory positions, but 2/3 of them were full-time jobs: cabinet secretaries, deputy secretaries, the undersecretaries, the assistant secretaries. So think of it as like the top 3 or 4 layers of management and their teams for each of a series of business in a big holding company. One's called Department of Agriculture, one's called Department of Transportation, Commerce, etc. And so what happens is that, we have a peaceful transition of government, but every 4 or 8 years, on January 20th, someone blows a whistle and all those people leave. A new CEO comes in, hires like a head of HR really quickly, right. And then says, give me an executive team, we're still flying the plane. And I need a pilot first. So what ends up happening is you get this kind of hurried pace. In the Obama administration, we did over 1,000 hires in the first 100 days. Not we, I wasn't there yet, so I can't take credit. An amazing group of people who worked before I got there did that. And so then I came in August of 2009. And I would say that a couple of things. One is something that I learned from Jack Lew, who was Deputy Secretary at State Department, then head of OMB, then Chief of Staff to Obama, and then Treasury Secretary, who's had an illustrious career in and out of government and is just one of the highest integrity people you'll ever meet. But he talked, when he and I were traveling around to agencies during the re-election year, getting people to kind of buckle down and stay focused despite all the noise. He told a bunch of stories about his experiences coming in and out of government and how there was this extra something. I say, when I talk about this now for myself, I talk about an extra 10%. I don't even remember if he put a percentage on it, but when you're serving other people at that type of scale, like when you're doing a job that is entirely about other people, it really is about other people, and it may make you bone tired, and you may be working around the clock and every single day, but there's just something else that you get from that. It's just different. And he goes away from it, and he's worked in the private sector and academia at really big jobs, but every time he comes back, he's reminded immediately. And that is part of what experience like was for me. But the other part of it was, we're team sport guys. Like, when you're part of a group of people that's working for this person who has a finite amount of time to try to do the things in the world you think are best, it is hard to find a greater feeling of being on a team than that. And the only thing that is more tangible is when all of you are waiting to see the outcome of a re-election. When you're all waiting to know in one evening whether you're all fired or you get 4 more years to do what you've been trying to do for the past 3 and change. When you win or lose, that is, you're on a team of 5,800 people, and you are tight. Like, I just remember being surprised. I don't know why I was surprised, but I remember being surprised of feeling that last week and the week after, of just feeling like everybody was like getting around each other, like everyone kind of like had packed into each other, kind of like paratroopers jumping out of a plane and landing in the darkness and having to form in the darkness. Like we just, it was this incredible thing. That was just one of the coolest things. But then the last thing is, whenever you work for somebody who's as bright as he is and is a voracious learner and has an inclusive style of management where they kind of bring everybody into the conversation, they want to hear all the opinions, but also is a high conviction person. Like when something's right, you'll go stand behind him, but he's the first one to go stand in front of the jet engine, right? And like sit and won't move. It's just, you're lucky if you get to do that once. I got to do that twice. I think Larry Fink and he are similar in that way. And it's just it was a great honor. It was an unbelievable privilege, which everyone always says. It was fascinating. It was the most entrepreneurial environment I've ever been in, because like if you say a good idea in a meeting, it's on you to the next day to make it happen. But it also takes a lot out of you. It does.
Have you
physically,
ever
mentally.
worked harder?
I think the startup phase of starting a company with two guys when we didn't know anything, the first 6 months when we basically didn't go home. I think people had that when they were starting before I got there in the White House. They had this exact same experience, even harder. I will say that the part that you underestimate is that if your normal range of stress is kind of 0 to 10 and you're kind of normally kind of like a 1 to a 7, right, let's say, you adjust to those environments and you think you're vacillating between 1 and 7, but you're really going between 4 and 11. So when you think you're recharging, you're actually not, because your stress is like you're kind of activating kind of fight or flight mechanisms, right? So your adrenaline's up, and so it's wearing down your body because it's meant to be for quick fights or running away from somebody for short bursts, not for 5.5 years in my instance. But you adjust so you don't really notice it. The people who had been there before were really smart about their regiment and their yoga and their eating and everything else, and the president was unbelievably disciplined about it. But when you're revving like that for 5.5 years, it takes a real toll on you. It does. And I don't say that to be sympathetic. I would make the trade any day, but it is something to be aware of. I'll tell you now,
I remember visiting you at the White House and thinking you did not look well.
Of course, you didn't tell me then. You should have told me that.
You had no choice. I mean, I sort of felt like you're working 24/7, and then some.
Yeah, I think the tricky part about it is that the world just never stops. So you're kind of looking at your phone every couple of minutes, because also conversations are going on that are making decisions. And if you don't get your word in, an hour later the conversation's moved. So it's that constant. It took me. My big mistake was not taking a lot of time off between that and BlackRock. I should have taken the time I took, in the beginning of this year. This was very slow to decompress and to figure out how to kind of deprogram from those. I remember the first time I was watching a place and I hear his voice, President Obama's voice, talking, and my blood pressure didn't go up, because normally when I heard his voice talking in an informal sense, I was wondering if he was going to announce something that might impact me. Work on it. It was like 4 or 5 months later, I heard his voice and I was just like, oh. Actually, no, it was 3 months later. It was almost 3 months, exactly 3 months, because I remember exactly when it was. But it was like 3 months, to kind of start to decompress from that stuff. And so, these jobs are hard, but I guess at the end of the day, you ask yourself, if you want the chance to be right and to have the ball and do something important, and you want to have a chance to have impact at scale, there's no other thing other than it's going to be hard. It's just you just gotta. But the thing I'm trying to do with my life better now is balance it more. I still thought I was probably 24 and didn't need all that, and so I didn't have the best habits around it. And so I'm trying to live. That's why I'm taking this year off. Actually, it's a little bit about just kind of recalibrating and decompressing a bit.
So you go from the White House to BlackRock, which is a hugely influential business across the economic spectrum. And you take a very important, very visible role as global head of diversity and inclusion. Why that role? And what did you hope to accomplish while you were there?
I mean, at the core of it, I guess, and I'm sure my boss, Jeff Smith, won't mind me saying this, because he and I talk about this a lot. And, I think at the core of what we were trying to do with that job, he and I, was to change the way people talk to each other at work. And I talk about this a lot when I speak publicly, but, when we were young, people started telling us that could we be a little more this, a little more that, or a little less this, or whatever, or you're too this, or whatever. And, we start taking that in. First on playgrounds, and then in school, and then, at work. We start taking that in, and the more different we are growing up, the more of a facade we create, or armor, I used to call it, that we build for ourselves, with more pieces in the chainmail, or in the metal. And over time, you start building this facade, especially at work, where people have told you you're supposed to behave a certain way. And you put it on in the morning, and you wear it all day long. And if it's not who you naturally are, nothing is super reflexive. You're playing golf all the time, not tennis, right? You're you're trying to think about what a person like the one you're projecting is supposed to do, not just doing. And then when you make a mistake, you're worried it's because you're caught between these two things, and you're worried that you didn't do it right, and you're trying to learn. And the stress of that and the daily grind of that is incredible. And yet we spend 70% of our waking hours during the work we get at work. Our current and future financial outcomes are linked to this place, as are our children's. Most people get gratification from a sense of accomplishment. A big portion of that's going to come from work and what you do every single day and during the week. And every time you hand your business card to somebody or whatever, you get a return on how they react one way or another. So this is a really big decision about this group you're joining. Now, given all of that, if you show up and you can only be 30% of yourself or 40% of yourself, and the rest of the time you're guessing, that's an incredible cost to pay. Plus, you're not going to be as good as you could be. You're not going to be as good as and as strong as the person who feels completely natural, is completely fluid, is operating reflexively most of the time, right? And is really happy and psyched to be there and has been fully utilized. There's just no way those two people are going to compete in a straight-up race. The second person's going to do better and do it longer. And so, for me, that was the whole thing. It all started with, we all put on these facades. What if we could break it down by getting people to talk a little bit differently and more personally at work? That was it. Now, there are a lot of other pieces to it, but that was the...
That's interesting, because this is all leading to the question I really want to ask you. When you start talking about a facade, when you look back, are there instances or moments where you feel like you didn't do you and maybe could may like a do-over?
So there are a lot of times I didn't do me, but I think, as I get older, I do me more. But there are a couple of kind of stair steps in the pattern, you know what I mean? One was my junior year in college. I remember being one floor below where my room was with a bunch of people. And are you getting feedback, by the way? Or is it just me?
No.
Okay, I'm going to start over again. I was getting feedback, but I'm going to start over. Okay.
Yeah.
So I've not done me many times. I think we're all kind of like figuring out who we are as we go, and it's a kind of a moving target. And to be clear, I don't really believe in regrets. I think that we're self-interest human beings. We bring our best guess at the moment when we have to make a split-second decision. And then if we learn more information later, it's not really worth having a regret about. But the first moment that really was like a pivotal moment for me, I think, in being more myself, was my junior year in college. I was one floor below. I can remember it like it was yesterday. I was one floor below where I live, standing with a group of students, and somebody said something really mean to someone else who was standing to my left. And I had a lot of social status because I was a soccer player and the captain of the team and a good student and elected to a million zillion different things. And I'll never forget the person next to me turned and looked, and in their eyes was this look of like help, like an expectation that I was going to do or say something. And these things happen so fast, and I didn't say anything. I didn't do anything. Right. And man, that dogged me for days. Like it bothered me for days. And it was something like a day or two later, I think like probably 24, 48 hours later, I do remember having where I was when I thought to myself, never again. Like never again am I going to be in a situation where something like that goes down. I know I speak up a lot, but never again am I going to be in one where I'm not willing to make it less comfortable in order to make it right. And if I feel like somebody, even if it's not me, if somebody might have been slighted, to speak up on someone's behalf, whether I know it to be true or not. So that was the first. The second was actually getting divorced, if you really want to know. Going through the process of getting divorced.
So hold on. Was it getting divorced or getting married in the first place?
No. It was getting divorced.
Okay.
I think it maybe should have been more getting married. I probably should have done more soul searching on the front end, to be clear. But it was the process of getting divorced, and I was just arriving in D.C., and I was in a new group of people, and making my way in, and it was just a period of time where I just did a lot of self-reflection, like intensive self-reflection, and I kind of started to believe, as we were talking earlier in the conversation, about kind of the different forms of your identity, that middle section where people assign things to you, and you got to be careful about that, because if you take on too much of that and it's not true, you start to create that gap between your true self and your projected self. And I just realized I kind of become someone either I wasn't or I had been, but I hadn't maintained. But for whatever it was, I just realized there's a pretty big gap between who I was and who people thought I was, and I was letting them think I was, and I was acting like I was. And it was actually it was a painful period of time, but it was actually very, very cathartic.
My guess is that a lot of people can relate to that, just given statistics.
Yeah.
So, hey, I want to thank you again for being on the show and for taking the time to share with me and with everybody who's listening. Really excited to have you on the show and looking forward to what's next for you.
Thanks, man. It was great talking to you, Eric.
All right, buddy. See you, John.
Bye.
A message from our sponsor, Alto IRA. Retirement in America is broken, and Alto revolutionizes retirement investing by providing access to investment opportunities beyond the public markets. It's online, automated, and simple. Plus, it's cost-effective. You don't have to be rich to invest in alternatives. Get started today at altoira.com.